that we are doing on multidimensional poverty. I must introduce you to the EGROW Foundation, a think tank which was set up about 5 years ago in the policy space. A think tank which aims to provide research-based policy advice to the government. We've been very successful in the last 5 years and working quite closely and associated with good amount of research that is being done at the NITI Aayog. We have been very fortunate in working on some of the pioneering projects, including the Prime Minister's talk about India in 2047. We have done a 2-phase report for NITI Aayog. In this last 5 years, our attempt has been to have a blend of scholars and researchers from across the world coming together and advising not only on issues that are relevant for India, even globally. That is why we had 2 Nobel laureates come and speak to us, one from Harvard and one from Stanford. And then we also did a series under G20 International Economic Order, Task Force 5. We are right now in the midst of a series empowering women. And we have already done 10 of them, and 5 more are lined up in the next 2 months. Today's topic is extremely relevant. We have been worried in our own country about poverty. Some of the scholars here have been working extensively trying to understand whether poverty in India increased after COVID or were we able to hold it back. Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who was at the IMF and who was earlier the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, especially wrote a paper on it and showed that the programs of the government during COVID were really stabilizing and people didn't just fall into the poverty trap. That study was later on substantiated by another study by the IMF. So in our country, this has been now an important issue. NITI Aayog came out with a multidimensional poverty report just about 2 months back, and that was discussed on our forum about 3 weeks back. To do this discussion, we are very fortunate to have Professor Sabina Alkire, Professor of Poverty and Human Development, and she directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the University of Oxford. Previously, she worked at the George Washington University, Harvard University, the Human Security Commission, and the World Bank. I don't know how I missed her, but I've been at the Harvard and been at the IMF, so at the World Bank, and I think I missed her. She has a DPhil in economics from the University of Oxford. Together with Professor James Foster, Sabina developed the Alkire-Foster method for measuring multidimensional poverty, a flexible technique that can incorporate different dimensions or aspects of poverty to create measures tailored to each context. With colleagues at the OPHI, this has been applied and implemented empirically to produce a multidimensional poverty index. So Sabina has also been contributing significantly in the multidimensional index which NITI produces. The MPI offers a tool to identify who's poor by considering the range of deprivations they suffer. It is used to report a headline figure of poverty, which can be unpacked to provide a detailed information platform for policy design showing how people are poor nationally and how they are poor by areas, groups, and by each indicator. In India, we have been talking about multidimensional poverty numerous times. There have been debates, pros and cons. Does it have a policy implication? Can it be used as a policy tool for intervention? Because at the end of the day, it's an index which combines numerous things. Or should we have the traditional poverty index that we used in our country based on nutrition? To chair this important session, we invited Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who is also the advisor of EGROW Foundation and is a senior India analyst for the Observatory Group, a New York-based macroeconomic policy advisory firm and chairman of Fox's Research and Investments. He was on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council before he went to the IMF as executive director representing India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. Dr. Bhalla is a very well-known name in our country as he writes extensively on economic issues and has also authored numerous books, one most important book that I thought he had written was The New Wealth of Nations. To discuss this important topic, we have Professor Kundu with us today, who's been at the JNU for many years. His work, especially on housing sector, is very well known. He was professor and dean of the School of Social Sciences at JNU, a member of National Statistical Commission, and chaired the Post-Suture Evaluation Committee, and that for estimating urban housing shortage. He was regional advisor on poverty at UNESCWA, Beirut, and consultant to Sri Lankan government on population census. With this, I hand over the session to Dr. Surjit Bhalla, who's chairing the session for us today. Sir.
Thank you, Charan, and welcome, Ms. Alkire. We have followed all, as Charan said, in India, it's almost a household word, the multidimensional poverty, and with Niti Aayog formally adopting it and creating their own version for it. So we're really looking forward to your presentation. Just before, from my side, I guess there are three questions that I hope your presentation answers. Why should we use, and I'm sure you've been asked this question many times before, why should we use multidimensional poverty index? And in particular, why should it be preferred to the absolute poverty index of the World Bank and various other individuals? And while on multidimensional poverty, there is the censored and uncensored versions of the indicators, etc. So if you can advise us as to which one should be used when and why. So floor is all yours. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. And it is really a delight and an honor to be with this group. And most of all, I'm looking forward to the discussion and suggestions and critical comments. And I will begin by mentioning that our aim is not to say that a monetary measure is necessarily preferred to a monetary measure, but rather it is to suggest that a monetary measure is incomplete and it doesn't show relevant changes in the lives of poor people that we think are interesting, we think are tractable, and they can be addressed in policy terms in manners that are different from how one might seek to improve the incomes of a range of different people. And so both are important and in a sense, ideally should be used in tandem. Indeed, OFI was privileged to work with the government of Mexico, who launched their multidimensional poverty measure in 2009. And in the case of Mexico, they did combine income and other dimensions into their multidimensional poverty index and ceased to separately report income. But no other government has followed them. And so the governments with official multidimensional poverty measures have used them alongside the MPI. And Sir Tony Atkinson, in the Commission of the World Bank, and later in his posthumously published book, Multidimensional Poverty Around the World, argues that when we think of a country and we think of its trajectories on poverty, we should look at an international poverty line, such as $2.15. We should look at national monetary poverty measures. We should look at the global multidimensional poverty index of UNDP, and we should look at national measures such as that by Niti Aayog, because these together might give us a better understanding of the situation of poverty in countries. So our hope is to contribute to a wider tablet of tools for different actors in this space. What I will do in this presentation is firstly review, for those who have not been so involved in the recent trends in multidimensional poverty in India, and then illustrate some of the new angles of research, some of which are ongoing and some of which are not yet ongoing, but which we would love to partner and work with others upon. And I preface this by saying this is an interesting topic perhaps for those within India, but it is even more interesting for those outside who have not seen large reductions of poverty in their own countries and would very much like to learn from a large yet a very diverse set of contexts, institutions, and situations, how poverty reduction took place in a much more analytical way than has been done simply by measurement work to date. So I will briefly mention this global stage, the actors who are very much interested in ongoing research on India, but then focus on subnational trends and the most recent global multidimensional poverty index. And that was first presented in a joint report with UNDP in 2022, and also in the 2023 joint report with UNDP as a case study. And the additional analyses I will present are taken from the online data tables from our website. The do files underlining them, as well as all of the methodological notes, are found online, authored by Usha Kanagaratnam and Nikolai Supa. And so if there are people on the call who want to know, in a sense, more of the details in order to use this work in a completely different way, we've tried to make at least the estimation sections of it and the data preparations transparent. And if you could disagree with us and can improve, it's very welcome. So I think this is not necessary for this august crowd, but just to remind us that a multidimensional poverty measure covers a set of indicators that are relevant to poverty in the context. In the Niti Aayog measure, for example, there are 10. I will be using a more basic global multidimensional, in the Niti Aayog measure, there are 12. I will be using a more basic measure, the global multidimensional poverty index, that has 10 indicators grouped into 3 domains: health, education, and living standards. And the 10 indicators are equally weighted within their dimension. A person's deprived in nutrition, if any person for whom we have nutritional data shows them to be underweight for adults or underweight or stunted for children. And if any child has died in the last 5 years, they're deprived in child mortality. If no adult has completed 6 years of schooling, they're deprived in that, or if a child is out of school up to the age at which they should complete class 8. If they cook with solid cooking fuel, primarily wood, dung, or straw, they're deprived if they don't have adequate sanitation or share it with other households. If they lack drinking water, access to electricity, housing with good materials, so a paka house, and if they don't have more than one of the following assets, they're deprived: radio, telephone, television, animal cart, computer, bicycle, motorcycle, refrigerator, and car or truck. What is, of course, new and by now familiar with the multidimensional index is that we're not just interested in singleton deprivations, but in people who have overlapping deprivations. In particular, they have a critical mass of deprivations in 1/3 or more of the weighted indicators, which means any 2 health or education indicators, all 6 living standard indicators, or at least 1 health or education plus 3 living standard deprivations. And so we do, others do, case studies, field work to try to understand and learn from these protagonists of poverty. This case study was done by Tasneem Mishra in UNDP's Human Development Report Office in Bangladesh. At a glance, we'll talk about the incidence or prevalence or poverty rate of the MPI, which is the percentage of people who are deprived in at least 1/3 of the deprivations. We'll also talk about the intensity, which is the average deprivation score among the poor. But the focal measure is the product of these two. When you multiply them together, you get a very simple measure, because my co-author, James Foster, being a theorist, loves elegance mathematically. And its key idea is that you are adding up in a linear way all of the deprivations of all poor people. So the value of the MPI, or the height of the bar, if the bar is that value, is equal to the weighted deprivations of all poor people. And why that becomes interesting as a policy tool is that if you reduce any deprivation of any poor person, that column goes down. And if deprivations are added of poor people, it expands. And so this is the axiomatic property of dimensional monotonicity, which means that it's a better overall measure than simply looking at incidence, which we published in a paper with Christian Oldeges and Ushika Nagaratnam, showing that in the case of India, in the earlier period, 2005-6 to 2015-16, if you only looked at incidence, the change was not pro-poor by state. But if you looked at the MPI, you captured much of the progress that was seen in the poorer states. And so then it was pro-poorest. And we see that again, 2019 to 21. So the global MPI is a measure that tries to compare over 100 developing countries, this year 110, and they are home to 92% of the population of the developing world. And we disaggregate by 1,281 subnational regions by age group, rural, urban area, gender of the household head, etc. And this year it's, of course, the NFHS 5 with trends available for NFHS 3 and 4. At a global level, of the 6.1 billion people covered, 1.1 billion are poor. That's around 18%. And half of them, 566 million, are children, which are defined as people aged 0 to 17. And at the global level, nearly 2/3 of the poor people live in middle-income countries and 1/3 in low-income countries. So it's more prevalent, of course, in the low-income countries, but not in terms of overall population. 47.8% live in sub-Saharan Africa, and just over a third, 389 million, in South Asia, of which 229 million, as we will see later, are in India. This has led to a call among other countries to supplement the global MPI with something that is less acute and more appropriate for many of the other regions, the Arab states, Latin America, East Asia, and the Pacific, where there is still poverty, but it is not as acute. And one of the research activities we have is to explore possibilities for developing such a measure that, for example, would have children attending through class 10, would require water piped into the house, would require a gendered look at the education indicators, and so on. So against this backdrop, in 2022, we showed that in 15 years, India had reduced its multidimensional poverty measure such that 415 million people had left poverty, and the MPI had fallen from 0.283 to 0.069, so to around 1/3 of its original level or less. And this was of interest on the global stage, which is where we're focused at the moment, because the Sustainable Development Goals call on countries to cut their multidimensional poverty incidence by 1/2 within 15 years. And this is the record of India within a different 15-year period, not starting at 2015, but at 2005-6. But it showed that it was possible and at scale. And it was also another principle of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. And the poorest groups had a faster reduction. And also the reduction among people deprived in half or more of the deprivations, which we call severe poverty, had a significant reduction across the board. The SDGs also call for integrated and multi-sectoral policies. Now, without knowing policy framework, simply from a measurement tool like this, one can, however, detect that all of the 10 indicators that constitute the MPI had a statistically significant reduction. When we consider reductions not among the whole population, but simply among those who are poor, that is deprived in a critical mass of other topics, and we'll come back to nutrition in a few minutes. This was led by progress in sanitation, cooking, fuel, and housing. Vulnerability, that is the population right above the poverty line, who are deprived in 20 to 32% of the indicators, could have gone up if people just sneaked out of the poverty line to right above it, but it did not significantly increase. It went from 17 to 18.7% of the population. A trend that I will come back to later is the trend by state. But this, of course, was quite interesting because this graph shows the incidence, the MPI value in 2015-16 on the horizontal axis. So Bihar was then the poorest state. And the vertical axis shows the reduction in poverty, with those closest to the bottom having had the fastest absolute reduction. And I prefer absolute reduction over relative, because each person's life has an equal weight in that measure. And by that measure, this is a pro-poor pattern in that the poorest states also had the fastest absolute reduction of poverty. And Bihar fell from 77% to 35%, for example. Jharkhand from 75 to 31%, Madhya Pradesh 69 to 24, Uttar Pradesh 69 to 23. So very, very significant reductions by more than half in all of the poorest states. Again, on a world stage, this was attention grabbing because India's depiction is in the bottom center, but some other countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Haiti, Democratic Republic of Congo, or Cambodia, in certain other periods, had situations where the poorest states did not have the fastest reduction. However, I should mention in Sylhet in Bangladesh, in the more recent period, 2014 to 2019, it has had the fastest reduction. And in Cambodia, the most recent period, 2014 to 2021-22, it also had a pro-poorest pattern. So these change over time, but this is in a sense explaining the interest in India's, the magnitude, the speed, and the pro-poor structure of India's trends. So now I'd like to delve in a little bit more to describing some findings that we think bear more observations. So this is a different bubble graph, and I apologize for putting it right after the other, but this also shows the incidence now, not the NPI, but the incidence on the horizontal, with Bihar, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh having the highest incidence of poverty, Kerala, Lakshadweep, Puducherry, Tamil Nadu, Delhi having the lower, Goa, the lowest incidence. And the height of the bar is the intensity, the average deprivation score among the poor. And that will range from 33% and up. In the poorest country, Niger, it reaches 65%. But as you see, it's not above 45% in any of the states. So it's highest in Meghalaya. But you do see a disturbing upward trend where in the states that have the highest incidence of poverty, each poor person is deprived in a greater share of deprivations at the same time. And this matters because when the MPI is used in other countries, for example, for budgeting, one doesn't only want to look at the number of poor people, because if each poor person's intensity is higher, then it will cost more to reach the deprivations of each poor person. So understanding intensity alongside incidence is important. Similarly, if you are targeting people poor in 2 or 3 deprivations, it is different than targeting people who are deprived in 5 or 6 deprivations. And so the policy responses need to understand this. And intensity just gives an overall feel, and then we can go into great depth to look at the composition of poverty by state. And all of this information, I should say, is in the online tables. But now we're trying to reappreciate it to understand research questions and policy levers. Another very interesting bit of descriptive information for measurement that can be a stepping stone to research is to look at how each state reduced the deprivations, both overall for all of the population in the state and among people who were poor in the state. This graphic shows the reduction in the censored headcount ratio, which is the percentage of the population that are poor and deprived in each indicator. Because we wanted in this study to compare India to other countries, it is annualized. we consider 2015-16 to 2019-21 to be a 4.5-year period. And so it's annualized by that time span. And we will talk later about different ways of computing time and the difference it makes empirically. But what you can see is that the listing of states is from the poorest to the least poor in terms of their 2019 to 21 MPI value. So Bihar, Jharkhand, Meghalaya, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, etc. And then the bars show the reduction in each of the 10 indicators. And at a glance, you can see that the yellow tinged red stripes are the reduction of nutrition. So you can see usually that they are quite high, but in some states like Tripura, it's relatively lower than the surrounding states. That is also because of lower initial rates of deprivation, which we can see from the tables. You can also see that the green tinged and brown tinged, which are respectively sanitation and cooking fuel, usually have the biggest reductions. And also the purple tinged housing indicator is significant. So across India as a whole, but also at most states, we can see that these 4 indicators had signal reductions. Zooming in, you can see different state patterns. And again, these must be read against the initial levels of deprivation. But in Bihar, this graphic is incorrect because it's lost electricity. But if the electricity bar had not been lost, and I will correct the slides before sharing, you would see that Bihar actually had a larger reduction in electricity than in any other indicator, which is unusual. But it went down very strongly, 5.85. Oh, it is here. It's the red tinged one here. That the sharpest reduction in Bihar was among electricity, and that's not the case in any other state actually. And so there are state-wise patterns that bear inspection, and also they bear comparing. So one question that my chair asked is, when do we use censored headcount ratios and when do we use uncensored headcount ratios and their changes? And at OFI, we always look at both at the same time before we write anything, because we want to know the difference. And the difference is very straightforward. The uncensored show the reductions across the population, and the censored show the reductions across the population, but only including deprivations among people who are also poor. So what that means is that if there was a deprivation, let's say nutrition, to which I will return, among a person who is poor, and then that person gets rid of every other deprivation, they will become non-poor. So the censored headcount ratio of nutrition will go down for that person, but that person might still be deprived in nutrition. So the uncensored headcount ratio would pick that up. So we look at them side by side because we want to both know who's getting out of a critical mass of deprivations and who is exiting from deprivations overall. Without panel data, we can't do that more precisely, but we do that quite carefully. In this time period, across the states, the reduction in terms of speed of multidimensional poverty and incidence is very similar. The only state with a 3-place change in rank is Chhattisgarh, which is much faster in reducing MPI, reducing intensity among the poor, than in popping the least poor out of poverty. But otherwise, the ranks only vary by 1 rank. And so while there are still some differences between MPI and incidence, they've come closer together in this time period than in the previous decade, 2005-6 to 2015-16. So one question that perhaps is relevant in India and certainly is relevant in globally is, how do we measure leaving no one behind? That is the topic of a paper that I'm working on with Christian Oldeges, Shuman Shet, and others. And what we are trying to explore is different definitions of leaving no one behind, to implement all of them on the India dataset for different kinds of disaggregations, rural and urban, subnational regions, children, etc. And also look at things like growth of the bottom 40%. So some more global definitions of transitions in deprivations that are not censored for the poor. And so this slide and the next few slides are stepping stones towards this. So if we first look at the India trends by rural and urban, they clearly had significant reductions in both of them. And at the top graph, we see the rural and the bottom is urban. The blue line is the poor or vulnerable. The middle line is the incidence of MPI, and the red line is severe poverty. And I mention this because one would worry that the number of vulnerable people would increase if incidence decreased. And we do see that in some countries. But we see that all three of them had significant decreases across these periods, with the first mentioned point being 2005-6, the middle 15-16, and the last one 2019-21. And rural areas did have increases in vulnerability, but they were relatively small in terms of magnitude. And the population shares of rural and urban were relatively stable. There was a little bit of urban to rural migration, but in the population shares that we have from the NFHS5 data set, the percentage of people living in rural areas migrated from 70% in 2005-6 to 69% in 2019-21. That's important because in other comparisons, like children, where these change a lot, we have a slightly more complicated interpretation. So all of the indicators had significant reductions and no big surprises there. We note the very strong reductions of electricity were prevalent in both urban and rural areas, which is again unusual compared to other countries, but a very positive finding. So just using what we have seen so far, are rural areas being left behind? In an absolute sense, they are not. They had the fastest absolute reduction, which, as I mentioned, is the measure that I prioritize. But if you think of growth, it's a relative measure. And so if we were to use a relative measure, unsurprisingly to me, it would not, because it is very difficult to have a faster relative reduction for poorer areas. And so in relative terms, rural areas would be being left behind. Just to interpret the relative and remind us all what it means, it shows the percentage of the distance to zero poverty that is covered in that particular time period. And this is annualized, again, for comparisons across different countries. But in relative terms, in rural areas, each period from 2005-6 to 15-16, they got 7.6% of the way, 7.5% of the way, to zero poverty. And in urban areas, it was 10.5% of the way. But remember that rural areas started with 68.1% of people in poverty and urban with 24.9. And so 10% of 24.9 is less than 7.6% of 68. So that's why we have to understand this, explain it, make sure that everybody knows what these numbers mean, because I've seen a number of studies using relative changes of MPI, and which we ourselves do in some work, but we need to understand how to interpret pro-poorness. Another question is whether the percentage of poor people living in the rural areas decreased. And actually, although there was a faster reduction in absolute terms, the percentage of people living in rural areas increased from 86% of the poor living in rural areas in 2005-6 to 90% in 2019-21. Overall, at a global level, 84% live in rural areas. And so this is an interesting finding. Again, one can think about whether the indicators of the MPI capture urban poverty adequately. And the definitions of rurality and urbanity, of course, are not comparable across countries, but it is a finding to look at. Another interesting group, of course, is children, and our data tables have different age cohorts, and all of the age cohorts in the case of India had significant decreases in both periods, but children significantly increased vulnerability. 199 million children left poverty in 15 years and 216 million adults. But the population shares changed. So in 2005-6, 40% of the population were children under the age of 18. And by 2019-21, it was less than a third, 32%. So one has to think of the number of children as we go on, also with the fertility, because a lot of the deprivations would be in early childhood if they pertain to child nutrition. Again, indicator reductions for children and adults follow the usual patterns and all are significant. And the same patterns for rural in terms of absolute and relative pertain to children having the much faster absolute reduction. And I must mention again on the global stage that this is interesting because we cover with UNDP 81 countries and as OFI 84 countries over time. And of those 81 countries, 42 countries, more than half, had reductions of children that either children didn't reduce at all, or children reduced MPI at a rate that was slower than adults in that time period. And so there are troubling trends globally for child poverty reduction. But again, this is a positive finding. And in contrast to rural areas, the percentage of poor people who are children decreased from 46 to 42.4%. Remember that the share of the population who are children also decreased more than this. So it's a complicated interpretation, but it is a positive trend. So that, in a sense, shows one type of research question. The rest of the questions that I'll introduce have to do forward-looking with learning from the past in India in order to try to shape reductions of the indicators within the multidimensional poverty index among the poor going forward. So just to remind us, at present, as I showed you on a global scale, 18% of people are poor, and in India it's 16.4. So India has come below the global average, having started well above it. And their intensity is 42%, and their MPI is 0.069. So it's 22 million people, and the bar chart depicts the censored deprivations. That is, no bar is higher than 16.4%. So of those 16.4%, what are the deprivations? 13.9% of the population are poor and deprived in cooking fuel, and nearly that in housing. And the next highest is nutrition, followed by sanitation. So those are perhaps interesting to look at. And we can look at that composition of poverty also by the states or by children or by rural areas when one is looking in a forward way. So these are the states in the same order as before. And just to look, Uttar Pradesh on the left of the on the right of the two red boxes, you see the darker mauve stripe just over halfway down. That's child school attendance. And so the present contribution of children out of school in Uttar Pradesh is higher than in Madhya Pradesh right next to it. Madhya Pradesh has slightly higher poverty, but quite similar. But Madhya Pradesh, of course, has larger challenges in assets as well as drinking water. So the state patterns change, and you can see just at a glance that they're quite different. If you look at Himachal Pradesh, for example, versus Punjab, and go up, so you look above it, again, they're very, very different faces of poverty across those two states. So this is information that could be useful. Now, stepping beyond the individual or the collective deprivations and even the state level deprivations, one area of work we're interested in doing is actual deprivation bundles or profiles. So a profile shows all of the indicators that a poor person experiences, and a bundle shows all of the people who are deprived in a certain set of indicators. So for example, if you look at the right-hand column of this is for the global MPI last year, 2022. And it shows that across the population, the most common deprivation profile is to be deprived in nutrition, cooking fuel, sanitation, and housing. And that 3.9% of all poor people globally have those four deprivations. And the next most common is the standard of living, to be deprived in all 6 standard of living indicators. And then you see all of the dark bars with the red dots all of those profiles have that original deprivation profile, but they also have additional indicators in their deprivations. And similarly, the red bars. So this is very interesting because one might want to think about policy responses. And it is quite interesting in the case of India. This is the same for India, where 15% of the poor people only have 4 deprivations: lack of nutrition, cooking fuel, sanitation, and housing. And that's in the 2019-21 data set. So that's 34 million people have those 4 deprivations. And so this might be useful information. And we are doing studies to compare this with other types of information like that I just showed you of percent contributions by state, to see how policies might be tightened, made, and public expenditure made more efficient by using this information, but also see where is it pushing the data too far in terms of standard errors, confidence intervals, etc. So there's a lot of technical work underlying the next step. Going forward, one reason, of course, for optimism is that 40% of the people who are currently poor in the 2019-21 data set are deprived in less than 40% of the indicators. One wants to focus on the poorest, but one recognizes that many of the least poor can also exit poverty efficiently. So before I move to the research question section, I wanted to do a couple technical notes. And I'll start with nutrition because it's the most important. There's been a lot of debate because if you look at the NFHS data set overall, nutrition doesn't have a stellar path of reduction, but it is strong. So using the definition that we use, namely that if any person in the household, which is a child aged 0 to 5, a woman aged 15 to 49, or a sampled male aged 15 to 59, if any of them have a low BMI, body mass index, or if a child is stunted, a child or underweight by 2 standard deviations from the median population, then they are deprived. And so for us, and this deprivation, 57% of people were deprived in 2005-06 and 31% in 2019-21. If we look at that 31%, as I showed you, 11.8% are also MPI poor, but 20% are not. And 12.5% of the population of India are vulnerable and deprived in nutrition, plus 1 living standard indicator. Anybody who's vulnerable is not deprived in nutrition, plus child mortality, plus education in terms of either school attendance or years of schooling by definition. They can only be deprived in 1 other indicator. And 7.2% of the population have 0 different additional deprivations of the 10 covered. They're only deprived in nutrition. So that's an example where we want to understand it further. It's distinctive. You don't find these patterns in Africa, for example, very often. And make sure that the MPI and the policy uses it's put to are intelligent based on other deprivations like nutritional deprivations among the vulnerable that might be priorities. There are also robustness tests we did using different numbers of years. You're looking at the mean month or the median month of each wave, etc. And everything that I present is a lower bound. So any other years would show more people coming out of poverty. And similarly, we looked at how we assign a year given the date of interview of the household. And so we did robustness tests to those. And just some notes that the district aggregation is slightly difficult in Delhi, but it's possible, and that we are using the UN deficit population estimates, and so these are responsible for some changes. Okay, I've left myself 4 minutes for next research questions, and this is the key part, so if possible I'll take 1 or 2 more minutes, but I won't go beyond that. So these are the next steps in terms of analysis beyond definitions of leaving no one behind. I should say that for those of you who are working in Stata, we now have a Stata toolbox, which runs these very fast with all of the benefits, not only of the 4 core Stata improvements, but now as a toolbox with full documentation. And also from this year, the global MPI data set will be included in the World Bank's World Development Indicators. So it'll be also in that standard reference, but perhaps without all of the disaggregated detail. So the key question on the global stage is, how did India do it? How did it reduce MPI? And for that, you need econometric analysis, usually multi-level regression, or some kinds of different analyses. And one can, of course, obtain easily state GDP growth figures, but public expenditure on MPI-related variables by schemes, both in the public sector and by other actors, is more difficult because it must be obtained at a state-by-state or district-by-district basis. And this must be complemented by definitions of institutional strength and accountability, and by key events of weather events, climate events, population movements, job shifts. And so this is the big unanswered question that we would love to talk more about, but I'll just flag it. I think we all know that and care about it. I am doing work with Shuman Shet, as I mentioned, on the growth, a more general framework than growth of the 40%, bottom 40%, but we've implemented it. The paper's outgoing with the last period of India's performance being included, and that's useful. Second, EGROW has been focusing on gender. So just a preview of gender results that'll come out in 2024. We can do children-related variables for nutrition, years of schooling, and school attendance, and women for years of schooling. And so one can go within and say, for example, of the poor children who are not attending school, how many are boys, how many are girls? Are the percentage of boys and girls different? And in the case of India 2015-16, there's a statistically significantly higher percentage of girls who are poor and not attending school than boys. When we move to nutrition, the numbers are much higher for the percentage of children who are 5 years old, MPI, poor and malnourished in 2015-16. But there's no statistical difference between girls and boys. If we look at intra-household inequality, because remember, if one child is out of school or one child is malnourished, all of the household is. But if we look at children who live in a household where one child is going to school, but another child is not, then 8.1% of Indians' children live in that situation. And 13% of children aged 0 to 4 live in a situation where some child in the household is undernourished and some child also aged 0 to 4 is not. And so there are things going right, even in households that do have undernourished children. And that could be learned from, could be studied further. And there are also interesting but complex indicators where you're in deprived houses because no adult in the house has completed 6 years of schooling. But there is a group of first-generation learners. So some child between the age of 10 and 17 has completed 6 years of schooling. And in India, it's 14.2% of children are pioneers. So that's quite high. So these first-generation learners will need some kinds of support. This will be updated and a lot more information provided later this year. And then we can look at overlaps between these. And this is the percentage of, or the number of people who live in households, only with malnourished children, only with out-of-school children, pioneer children, etc. So gender is something the MPI lends itself to. And as I said, we'll have a major study out in spring of 2024 with Usha Kanagaratnam, based on the methodology that I've flagged in this paper by Rizwan al-Haq. There's also a question about going beyond poverty from the same dataset to look at well-being. And certainly Bhutan is famous for the Gross National Happiness Index, but it would be interesting to have a linked well-being measure that uses some additional variables. So we can nest different definitions of measures. There is an initiative that we have in Oxford in February where we're gathering many people to talk about multidimensional poverty data and what would be needed to make strong measures in standard data sets, and how the new methods of data collection that provide the joint distribution of deprivations can be drawn upon. And the last topic I'll share is simply environment. So if we look at Madagascar, which is the island to the east of Africa, it's quite a poor place. It did not have a good reduction in multidimensional poverty, the number of poor people increased. But we have incorporated environmental data looking at indicators that strike the same people at the same time, merging them geospatially with the location of the households and a radius, and then putting them into a database. So these are the clusters, the PSUs of the households. These are the variables we looked at, which were quite a number, and I'll show you just the ones we chose. But for example, cyclones are important in Madagascar. So this is the satellite overview, and we just extracted the data for the households and the cyclones events that had struck them. We also looked at forest loss within a 10-kilometer radius, air precipitates within a 10-kilometer radius, earthquakes, fire, and we're adding drought. So you can see that there are lots of radii of different events in different time periods. And so this is how I think many of us know, many of us are working on different geospatial merging with buffer zones, reshaping polygons, extracting them, etc. And in our case, we built a fourth dimension and looked at the trends. We've not gone further because there's some problems with the sampling that we're writing up technically. I'm happy to talk about, but I think this is a very, very important area for next steps. So I think I'll stop there, but I will mention that many countries are also, and with the NFH's data, one could create an individual child measure that, like the environment data, had an additional dimension, but that dimension was individual indicators for children, such as breastfeeding for people 0 to 6 months, or child labor for older people, early pregnancy, etc. So a number of countries are using these linked measures to have a stronger database on children. So thank you so much. I'm sorry to have gone very slightly over my time to 43 minutes, but I really look forward to the interchanges and to partnerships, because I think it's important to try to learn critically and rigorously something more about these trends, but also think of ways that the measurement work could improve, and that perhaps, if possible, some of the data environment could be expanded to new areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabina. That was very both informative and comprehensive, and so comprehensive that it becomes difficult to isolate which one one should use. I just want to bring up, before asking Amitabh to comment on your paper, about some of the problems that may arise or have arisen regarding measurement and the policy inferences from that with regard to India. Now, as you may know, that there are, even in India's case, there are 3 separate measures of the call periods for determining poverty. And in 2011-12, the uniform recall period, which is all expenditures on a 30-day period, had an estimate of poverty of 23%. And the comprehensive mixed reference period, where vegetables and fruits and perishables are measured on a 7-day recall, the end result is in the same year, for the same country, you have, just by making the absolute measure of poverty slightly more comprehensive, as recommended by all the experts, including Angus Deaton, what you get is there were 100 million people who were misidentified as poor by in the same year, the same time period. So there are no problems of comparability across time and droughts and so on and so forth. So you have just as minor change in definition brings about a change in 100 million people. And in the multidimensional poverty index over 5 years, you have something like 130 million people are brought out of poverty. That's just something about which all of us economists have to worry about is how do we communicate to the policymaker that, listen, this one is more relevant and perhaps more prone to policy advice than the other. The second one on, and you correctly noted, as you know, nutrition is a big problem in India, or according to the multidimensional poverty index as well as others. And back in somewhere around the late 70s and early 80s, the World Bank had, as its official poverty measure, come out with measuring calories. So therefore, the less calories you had, the more poor you were. Literally measuring people by their calories intake. And you had FAO coming out with its definitions, you had the World Bank coming out with its definitions, and so on and so forth. And you had the US coming out with its standards. What I want to point out here is that, one, that if you took the US standard, which was lower than the FAO standard on calories, about 80% of American women were malnourished. This is in the Haynes Nutrition Survey in the early 70s, and about 70% or 67% of the men were malnourished and therefore poor in that year. So you have, therefore, I want to ask as to what are the measures that, on nutrition that we can rely on to give us an accurate indication. And if there are measurement errors, what is their magnitude? Last question on that is, you have the Sukhatme at that time had pointed out that there was large inter-individual variation in amongst individuals, which accounted for a large part of the difference in their nutrition intake. Any light that you can shed on as to what inter-individual variation, purely individually, purely exogenous to the actual nutrition level that you measure, the average, what is the standard deviation around that? And this is, of more than casual interest in India, because it turns out that, India is one of the most poor countries in the world, if you look at nutritionally. So those are the two broad questions that I have. And I will now turn to Amitabh to give his comments.
Thank you, Surjit. Am I visible and audible? Okay. Thanks. See, it's simply overwhelming to listen to Sabina talking about multidimensional poverty with so much of clarity, lucidity, and rich data, giving the disaggregation by states, by gender, by age group, by different sectors, different dimensions. And I hope EGROW Foundation would record it, and this can be easily used as a teaching material in many of the universities, because I've never heard such a rich presentation on the multidimensional poverty index so far. So this has really been a big thing for many of the academics, administrators, policymakers to directly listen to this from Sabina and get the clarifications. I'm not going into the detail of the empirical results, because these are, as I said, subject of many PhD theses and MPhil theses in the universities already. And since Sabina has given a very clear presentation on that, I just raised 2 points about this empirical thing. Then I would really go into the methodological issues, because I thought, since we are discussing the global poverty report, how do you really compare across countries and the changes that are coming up in the global system, how that would be captured
in multidimensional poverty index. I would not get into the methodological issues for measuring consumption-based, expenditure-based poverty and income-based poverty. You see, one thing that I would like to tell you, Sabina, that although in the Indian Niti Aayog's report, there are 2 additional indices, and there has been some criticism that access to banking has been included, and it is mentioned that many of the accounts do not have much money, and to equate access to banking without much transactions equal to drinking water, sanitation, giving equal weightage may not be fair. The second thing is about the deliveries that have taken place in the last 5 years, which has attended, is another additional indicator on the health dimension. Since total fertility rate in India has gone down dramatically during the period 2015 to 2021, one would expect that that will contribute to the reduction of the poverty. But surprisingly, what we notice is the reduction of poverty, same period, similar indicators, NITI shows a reduction of 135 million. And the global report shows a reduction of 139 million. So I'm quite sure about it that although we say that the same indicators have been used, the rest of the 10 indicators, they are not the same. You look at the details of the indicator, the numerator and the denominator are somewhat different. Our coverage, for example, of nutrition is not for all age groups. NFHS data puts that constraint. So these are the things which need to be really looked into, that how come the comparisons do not give exactly, because we are expecting, anybody was expecting, those who are criticizing the Niti Aayog's inclusion of these 2 reports, they have to answer that how come the poverty reduction in the global report for India is slightly higher than what Niti has reported. The other point you talked about is urban, rural poverty share going up. And we have been discussing this in India. Surjit was also present. Charan had organized a meeting, and we are finding out whether urban definition itself is capturing the economic dynamics which is coming up in India, and they are getting really located outside rural areas, outside urban areas, because there is no space for the industries to be located in the urban areas. So that dynamic gets missed out in terms of economy. But as far as the basic services and access to well-being is concerned, many of the peripheral areas are very, very degenerated. World Bank has talked about degenerated peripheries. Many of the large villages which should be identified as urban have very poor quality. In fact, Registrar General has said that many of the small towns and the large villages, they should be considered as slums. So there are definitional issues which I am sure you'd be able to look at. But let me, can I have my PPT, please? There are a few methodological issues that I thought I will share with you, and I will get your reaction. The first question that I'm going to pose is, what is new and what is great about this multidimensional index? And this is not a question that I'm raising. I've heard this question in the last 3-4 months, that what is so new about this multidimensional index? Frankly, we have been having multidimensional indices right from early 20th centuries. The first set of social scientists who use multidimensional index are the psychometricians. They wanted to rank the students who have grades in mathematics, language, retention, memory, initiative. And so several dimensions came in and they wanted to aggregate them. Similarly, sociologists, regional planners, they wanted to measure levels of deprivation at district level, village level, and they also worked a large number of indicators. And how did they combine? Not by a simple methodology that, Alkire Foster method proposes. They use very complex statistical methods, principal component analysis, where the weightages can emerge from the data set itself on the basis of interdependencies, coefficients of variation. And there's so much of, competition of really putting forward your own methodology that Curitin argued in 1930s that these multidimensional index makers, they are dangerously insane. And they all feel that the solution for their insanity is my brand of principal component analysis, my brand of composite index, rather than his. So there was total confusion as far as the, construction of composite indices are concerned in the social science literature. Happily, the economists avoided doing that because Kenneth J. Arrow said, impossibility theorem. You cannot have ranking by different people or different indicators and combine them into one composite index without violating basic axioms of logic. And that is why many of the economists in my university, Jawaharlal Nehru University, when I started working on multidimensional poverty at the regional level, they said, Amitabh, you and your center people will go to jail because you are violating some basic axioms of logic. Happily, I've been a student of Professor Amartya Sen and a great admirer of Dr. Sabina Alkire. I was very happy that these two people helped in rescuing economic analysis from the quagmire of, neutrality or theoretical purity, because Amartya Sen said that this is the theoretical purity of many of the economists, which does not allow them to get into the areas of active policy intervention. And Sen and Huck certainly did a great job in bringing out the Human Development Index, which was certainly used for policy intervention. Nonetheless, what is new about it? Can we go to the next slide, please? You see, first thing which is certainly new, and Dr. Alkire has clearly mentioned that, please go to the next one, that multidimensional poverty index is based not on the regional data. When I calculated, poverty at the regional level, I would have percentage of illiteracy, percentage of households not having access to, infrastructure, hospitals. So it was number of hospitals, number of kilometers of road mileage, number of schools per thousand population, that kind of an indicator, which is not individual based. What the first slide showed, Dr. Alkire mentioned that if multidimensional poverty index for the year 2019-21 is X, and if one person moves out of multidimensional poverty, X will go down. It is sensitive to each individual households moving out of poverty. Not only that, even if a household which is multidimensionally poor does not get out of poverty, but reduces its deprivation, your overall national level poverty index will get reduced. That is a great advantage, that it is really based on individual household level data. Now she mentioned that how for environmental parameters, they're trying to construct individual related environment, because the environment generally is assessed at the macro levels. You don't have individual level, but nonetheless, this attempt that she brought in towards the end in the Madagascar, that how that can be brought in is certainly an innovation. But now, the first, I totally concede that this is based on the individuals, and that's a great improvement. Second, you have seen the rich presentation, how Dr. Alkire was talking about decomposability. She was talking about contribution of different indicators, because this is a linear aggregation. I remember first time I had a discussion with her, I was trying to bring in non-linearity and, how the weightage can vary at different levels. But, when you're doing an exercise at the global level or a national level, you have to make the methodology simple. So I think decomposability is something which is an extremely powerful, component of this analysis, which has been presented with lot of clarity. The third thing, which is, as I said, new and great about the MPI, is that it gives it some kind of a global framework for bringing in empirical rigor. I'm quite sure, and I have seen a lot of criticism of the multidimensional poverty index coming from Niti Aayog, both from within the government and outside the government, saying that, well, I can replace this indicator, numerator can be changed, denominator can be something else. I know I have done my research on health. Other indicators are much better. They capture, the data sources can be questioned. Of course, it is very easy to debunk and say these 10 indicators can be replaced by another set of 10 indicators, and I have no problem. And I don't think I would be able to defend any 10 indicators in a very, very conclusive, definitive manner. But what is the advantage of the MPI coming from the global UNDP, OPHI, is that there is some kind of a broad framework which is within the human development framework, talks about instead of income, material well-being, health, and education captured at the household level. I have seen multidimensional poverty index being used in different countries, and they have added, as in India, we have added 2 indicators. We added, when I was working with UNESCO in Beirut, in Lebanon, we worked out multidimensional poverty for Arab countries. We added one very important indicator, which is FGM, female genital mutilation. And we had to fight with the whole Arab League. And they said, no, this is not this is a cultural factor. There's nothing to do with deprivation. But nonetheless, we succeeded, and he said, well, there are certain cultural factors which certainly reflect in deprivation of the woman, and female genital deprivation is one of them. So I have a feeling that there is some scope, although the large framework of 10 indicators with some variation in the numerator and denominator. As I said, there are variations in most of the indicators when they are adopted at the national level. But nonetheless, the larger framework remaining same really reduces the possibilities of vested interest coming in and suddenly say, let us show decline or increase in poverty in certain period and add this indicator. That possibility gets reduced. And given some amount of skepticism that I've seen in the last few months, I have always argued that let's not throw the baby with the bathwater. Let us see how much we can use it in our policy interventions by the government, because there is a significant reduction which has taken place, which is, evidence from other sources also, unless there is some genetic deficiencies in the baby. And that's what I want to discuss in the remaining 10 to 12 minutes that I have. Please come to the next slide. First question that I have, and I would like to know from Dr. Alkire, the weights are exogenously given, right? Within each dimension has equal weightages: health, education, and material well-being. And within each dimension, every indicator has equal weightage. Whereas the traditional composite indexes construction was based on weightages emerging from the data set. If you construct a correlation matrix and assume that indicators which are highly correlated would be more important. So that was the kind of a framework wherein from country to country, the different indicators will have a different. So if you are doing it for India, all the states, you have indicators brought in, look at the interdependencies and build up a theory that how the weightages can be linked with the data set, data configuration. But nonetheless, there are problems therein and advantages and disadvantages. And I personally believe that at the national level or at the global level, if you are doing it and making it temporally comparable, earlier, you remember UNDP also tried to generate the weightages from the data. It took maximum or minimum for each indicator, which varies from year to year. And they realized that creates problems of comparability. So they brought in the goalpost. So I would think that this is not a serious disadvantage, that the weightage are not generated from the data, but one can do that also. I mean, there are some advantages, but I think this is not a major issue. The second issue, which I would like to consider, all those who are using or thinking of using it in the global context, is that the axiom of redistribution. This is an index that Sen has propagated, and Sen says if there is a redistribution among the poor, suppose there are two groups, both of them are multidimensionally poor, and there is some redistribution that those who are slightly better off among the poor are transferring something to those who are worse off, who are below them. So there is redistribution among the poor, slightly better off are giving. That should be reflected in reduction of poverty. This does not happen in multidimensional poverty index because you are using linear addition. You are not using Gini index framework. If in a Gini index framework, if there are two people who are below poverty line by ₹50, that is one situation. Second situation is one person who is deprived by 100 rupees. So which one is the worst situation? Obviously, Sen argues and Gini index argues that one person being deprived by 100 is a more significant poverty than two persons deprived by 50 each. So they're not additive. But I have noted that multidimensional poverty index M2, which is squared gap of multidimensional poverty, which is not being used at the moment, but that remedies that problem because that gives the squares it up. The moment you square 100 and square 250, you obviously get a higher value. So this is another thing that this MPI violates the axiom of redistribution. And I can tell you an example. Suppose there are two regions, A and B. A region, there's a large number of people who are multidimensionally poor, and the depth of multidimensional poverty, they're much higher. There's another region which is also multidimensionally poor, same number, but their depth of poverty is not that high. Where should you locate a school or a hospital? If you locate it in any one, multidimensional poverty index will give the same amount of reduction because the depth of poverty is not being captured in MPI as at the moment, not the squared ones. So that is the second point that we can think about it, that way, whether we can address this in some way. Please go to the next one. The third point that strikes me in the context of the multidimensional poverty index, which is being used. Can we go to the next slide, please? Demographic transition that is taking place globally, right? Which is resulting in reduction in total fertility rate. Now, suppose there is no change in the infrastructural conditions, physical conditions, everything remains the same, economic conditions, everything remains the same in a country. But there's a decline in the total fertility rate, which means number of children will go down. Number of children in the age group of 0 to 6 or 6 to 18 has gone down. If that has happened, the number of children going to school would also go down. Number of deaths below 18 years of age will also go down because the total number has gone down. Since it is based on individual, the households which did not have any child, let's say, in the school going category, or a household which did not have anybody in the age group of 0 to 18, there will be no death of the child. So that household will be considered to be non-poor. Any household which doesn't have a child would be considered to be a non-poor in education. But Niti Aayog says educational indicator of the child is reflecting the character of the household itself. That will be missing. So what happens over time? Since the number of children will go down, number of people in the 18 age group will go down, overall, these households which do not have that, as per the present methodology, will be considered to be non-poor. So understandably, over time, the households who are reporting no children death, no children not going to school, because there is no children there. So this is another thing. And I have raised this issue with Sabina herself, that if certain indicators are not relevant for certain household, like there's no child there. So out of 10, if 4 indicators are not relevant for a household, then the evaluation of the household should be made on the basis of the 6 indicators for which information is available. Because the household, Surjit was raising this issue. What is this censoring and non-censoring? Censoring is the household which has 33%, below 33% deprivation is not considered to be poor. If the poverty value is more than 33%, then only it becomes poor. So now the question is, if certain number of households are not really reporting any value because it is not relevant, they should be evaluated. They should be 33% of the 6 indicators, not the 10 indicators, because you are assuming that in other 4 indicators for which the information is not relevant, the household has got no poverty. That is one thing that I would like to be considered, and there's a perverse result which is possible. Suppose over time, the school attendance has gone down. Percentage of children in the age group of 6 to 14 attending school has gone down, suppose. And number of children who are dying in the age group of 0 to 18 to the total children have gone down. Sorry, I mean, suppose it has become worse. Children are not going, their attendance has gone down and number of deaths have gone up. Still, MPI can show a decline because MPI will exclude those households where children are not there. So it is possible that nationally, the number of children attending the school divided by total number of children. So denominator is number of children. Since number of children has gone down, even if there is a perverse trend in the society that attendance rate has gone down, number of deaths for the children in the age group may have, also I'm giving hypothetical case, may have gone up, and yet MPI can decline because it would assume, if we follow the present practice in many countries, which we've done in Lebanon, also West Asia, also those households will be considered as non-poor because there are no children there. So I think there has to be some thinking about how do we compute poverty in situations when large number of indicators are, not being relevant. For example, I'll give you one example. Number of migrant workers in urban areas, poverty has gone up in 5 or 6 districts. It is very difficult for poverty to go up, because once you have education, once you have access to toilet facility, drinking water, next year you will not lose it. But in some cases, it has gone up basically because of the migrants coming in. Migrants have another issue. Large number of migrants don't cook. They get the food from outside. It is cooked jointly somewhere. They would say, I do not use any biofuel. I do not use cow dung or coal. So they are non-poor in that indicator. But actually, that indicator is not relevant for them because they don't have the cooking arrangement within their household. So this is an issue which needs to be addressed. Can we go to the next slide, please? I'll just take another 2 minutes and then I'll finish. Can we go to the next one, please? Right, there's none. Okay, so I just thought I'll mention one more thing, that because of COVID or because of some political disturbance in certain regions, the census or data may not be canvassed. As you know, NFHS does not give nutritional data, which is a very important contributor to poverty. It doesn't give nutrition data for the age group 18 to 55, 18 to 50 for men and women. In many countries, that has been used, that has been included. Because it is not available, we are assuming that there is nobody who is deprived in that category. So it is quite possible in future, with development taking place, as I said, if demographic transition takes place, number of children goes down, fertility rate goes down, obviously there is a possibility of decline, with everything remaining same. Economic activities, infrastructure, health, medical field remaining the same, it can still go down. And I would think that over time, if you find for certain reasons in certain areas, data could not be available, you should not be taking them data, they are non-poor, and that assumption would certainly needs to be. The last point that I would like to say, when I said that over time this can happen, and you'll say, oh, it may happen after 20 years, so why do you take a hypothetical situation? No, in a global report, temporal and cross-sectional get combined. When you're talking about, even within the developing world, some countries were at 20 years ahead. So you are making a comparison of two situations which can be temporally different, but cross-sectionally you are making comparison. So I certainly therefore think that this index has to consider how the non-reporting or non-relevant indicators need to be built in. And finally, I would respond to Surjit's one comment. He said that should there be censoring? John Drace argued with Surjit, and I was also there. He says that, look, censoring is not needed. Anybody who is deprived in any of the indicators out of the 10 or 12 indicators should be considered to be poor. I think there's a very strong position, which MPI does not take. That MPI says 33% score should be there. Above that, only you are multidimensionally poor. But I think there is no harm in saying that if the person is deprived, the household is deprived in nutrition, it should be considered poor. And then for the others, you can apply 33% criteria. So that, I think, is a good compromise in the context of India, since there is so much of, and nutritional variable is something which will vary over time. So I would therefore think that there is some modification that can be brought in so that you combine the censoring and uncensoring. Any household which is deprived in nutrition should be considered as poor, and then for the others, you can apply your 33% criteria. I thought these are some of the suggestions that I should put before you for you to consider and perhaps respond and tell whether I'm thinking in the right direction. Thank you, Sabina. Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you, Amitabh, for a very detailed analysis. I will, before handing over to Sabina, you are obviously thinking that the nutrition indicator is a super indicator, and therefore there's a lexicographic ordering, yet another one, for considering somebody poor if they're poor in nutrition. And my question was, which I hope Sabina will answer, that the measurement errors involved in this, especially in nutrition, may be too, need to be surmounted or need to be addressed before we conclude. So Sabina, I would say that if you can answer some of the comments made, some of the questions raised, and then we move to the audience.
No, thank you both so much. This is very, very helpful. And you've really made some fantastic points. I will go in order as you suggested, Chair. So in terms of the nutritional questions, I don't have a deep understanding of the calorie data because we use primarily across many countries the direct anthropometric. And the reason is that in the countries that have MPIs, no country uses the data on the number of calories because metabolisms differ, ages differ, the extent of hard work that requires extra calories because it's a physical job versus a desk job vary. And so there's so many difficulties in converting a sense of calories into a overall nutritional outcome.
Sorry, if I can just, my only reference, I don't believe in the calories data.
Okay.
My only, the reason I brought that up is that the calories data was very, very deficient nutrition indicator. So the nutrition indicator that you are using, how perfect is it in capturing nutrition? God forbid I should argue for the use of calories.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, yeah. Good. So as you said, there will be a group of people who will appear undernourished, i.e. their body mass index will be under 18.5, but they will be technically well nourished by other medical exams. But my understanding from talking with, we talked with a bunch of health experts, obviously in this indicator, is that it's less than 1%. And so it's an outlier, and that usually if people are underweight, then that does affect their condition. However, I mentioned the case of fashion models who usually have a body mass index of 17 or 17.5 to appear on magazines where that kind of body type is preferred. And so in that case, I think the MPI tries to get around it by saying if you have one more deprivation, then you are vulnerable, and multiple ones would make you poor, because there would be some categories of persons, jockeys, persons who might have a light body weight for professional purposes, and some who might have eating disorders that would also be a cause of that rather than undernutrition. So a policy responding to undernutrition, if you have an eating disorder, isn't going to make it better. So there are certainly difficulties around the edge. We don't, as you know, include body mass index for countries like China that have it for people aged 70 and above. And the reason is that there's no medical guideline from WHO, from UNICEF, from anyone, but the bone density of older persons decreases with age. And so the body mass cutoffs and their accuracy for older persons is not calibrated. And so for that reason, we had to take a terrifying decision, because we're not experts, to say above 70, we are simply not going to use nutritional information because there's no official international cutoff we can stand behind. And we don't know how it varies across regions of the country, of the world. So I think that's the best we can do. I think the other factor that I'll return to, which Amitabh pointed out correctly, is that family size matters, as well as who is included in the survey. And if I had to be critical of the global MPI, one of the problems we cannot get around is that in many countries, we do not have data, anthropometric data for women or men, only for children. And we're comparing that to countries where we have it for women and men. And in some countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Nigeria, we have both surveys in different years. And so we harmonize them, but we can also see that in some countries, it makes a large difference whether or not we have adult undernutrition information. But I think the best we can do is make that transparent, talk about it, teach about it, and call for anthropometric data of adults to be more widely gathered. So there will always be disagreement about everything. There's disagreement with us from many actors about not including wasting for children. I think it's volatile, but many would be critical of that. Other experts say it's too volatile, and so it adds a kind of seasonality into our analysis, which is why we don't use it, but we're criticized for that as well. So I don't think there's a perfect measure, but hopefully this is at least pushing the boat out in terms of what we can do comparably and transparently. In terms of measurement errors, it's very interesting because Tony Atkinson in his commission to the World Bank recommended reporting not sampling errors, which of course we do, your standard errors and confidence intervals, but total measurement error, including non-sampling measurement error. Angus Deaton suggests it might be lower in MPIs, but we need to know. Something like wasting would have higher measurement error because of seasonality. Others might have, like some of the early childhood questions that are not in the MPI, we discarded for the reason you said. It had a short recall period, which makes it accurate in terms of non-sampling measuring error, but inaccurate in terms of reflecting that household's deprivation over the past year. And so in the MPI, we want longer recall periods if we can stomach or manage the non-sampling measurement error, because we want this to be representative of the past year of the household. So there are these considerations, but it's a good point to continue to raise and work on. And in terms of the deliveries in bank account and Niti Aayog, very, very briefly, I'll just put it up because I think it's important to understand, and there is a clear answer or reason for that. And it basically has to do with the indicators that were added. And they were, as you've said, the bank account and the bank account and maternal health. And those came up from the consultations that were had with different actors about what should go into the measure. But if you look at maternal health, which is the third green indicator set, and bank account, which is the last far right pink, you see two things. You see, first of all, that the height of those bars is lower than, for example, cooking, fuel, sanitation, housing, or nutrition. You see that the decrease is substantial. In fact, seems to be higher than decreases in the education indicators or in some other indicators. So why and what is the difference? First of all, the other 10 indicators are they're taken from the global MPI. So they are not, in a sense, adjusted with one, I think, change in some of the housing indicator. But otherwise, it's exactly the same as the global MPI do files. But you see that the overall headcount ratio is 15% versus 16.4% in 2019 and 25% versus 28% in 2015-16. And that's because these new indicators have lower levels overall. And because of that, then the number of people who come out of poverty is similarly lower at and so that's, in a sense, the reason. It's not, I think, a bad reason if normatively it's important to have that input. But it is important, in a sense, just to be clear on that. And then moving to the share of rural and urban and the definitions of rurality. So the Demographic and Health Survey team, or the NFHS team, use the definitions of urban and rural when they do the sampling and use those definitions. They relist in the primary sampling units, but they use the government definitions of urban and rural that were in place at the time that the sampling took place. And so we use those as well, but we know they are not comparable. And FAO is trying to have comparable definitions of rurality and urbanity suggested to different countries in case they agree. And I thought Amitabh's discussion of principal component analysis was very, very good and touched on the points that we would cover and agree with. And so linear is simple, but it's appropriate for ordinal data. It's comparable across countries. And the only thing I might add is that we do and publish robustness tests. Again, I come back to Tony Atkinson, who said it's good for the measure to be robust to a range of weights. And it is, and we publish this. But it's bad if it's robust to all weights, because then it adds no value. And so that'll bring me back to the first point. Why do we censor? So in table 2 of the global MPI data tables that are online, we have a set of tables that show what would happen if we don't censor. And if we don't censor, then 75.25% of the population of India in 2021 are poor. That's 1.059 billion people. And those are the people who are deprived in any one of the 10 indicators. And so that's, in a sense, why we want, for policy purposes, to focus on people who are the poor, who have overlapping deprivations and a critical mass. Now, there was an interesting suggestion of automatically including people with a nutritional deprivation. That's not been done, but we could certainly think about that, not as a global measure, because of these other professional categories that may have low body mass indices. But I think it would be an interesting paper to do, and you could do it for the data set in India. In terms of the M gamma and the Gini coefficient and M2, I think that is important. And James Foster and I have a different paper, which I'd love your comments on, Professor Kundu, that squares the deprivation score of the poor. Right. And it does respect the transfer principle that the M0 does not. M0 respects a weak transfer principle, but not a strong transfer principle. So if you have a regressive transfer among the poor, both of whom remain poor, but nobody pops out of poverty, the level of poverty will be the same. This person earlier was deprived in 40%, now it's 35. This person was earlier deprived in 40%, now it's 45. But MPI will be the same.
You cancel out.
And so what you were saying is that with the transfer principle, poverty should monotonically decrease, a strong transfer principle. And the M gamma measure that we have would do that. When we implement it, we don't find it makes much difference empirically, but I think theoretically it certainly does. So we've tried to offer that. I know time is running out and I'd love to have more discussion, so I'll just be very brief and say two things about the demographic and transition. I think that is very true. And we are trying to think about how to work with demographers. For example, in the European Union, there's a lot of discussion as household size and patterns change. They differ across migrant and non-migrant households. These add to complexities of any household measure, and particularly an income poverty household measure, but in our case, equally a multidimensional one. I would only say when we implemented the initial MPI, Maria Santos and I looked at household size, and for a per capita, it's always monotonically increasing, but for ours, it's not. It's a shallow U. And we also looked at households with and without children. But I think you're right. In looking at changes over time, we need better models of thinking about household demographic changes. And it's an area that needs research. So thank you. I think I'll stop there to allow more exchange, but I'm very, very grateful for these inputs.
Surjit, just one point. Surjit,
Yeah.
leave aside.
Yeah.
Sabina, you leave other issues, other questions, methodological issues. Just one simple thing. Suppose you find in a household, all the 10 questions are not relevant. Only 6 questions are relevant. And I entirely agree with your MPI framework. There has to be censoring. You can't say anybody who is deprived in any indicator, as John Gray says, should be poor. I don't think that's fair. That's not fair. So what you are saying is that deprivation should be more than 33%. So out of 100, if the person's household's deprivation is 33, then it is poor, multidimensional poor. Now I'm saying that all the 10 are not relevant. The fellow has answered only 6 questions in the exam. So you bring down from 33 to 18 and say anybody, if he crosses 18, then he's poor. You don't give 33 as the cutoff point. That is my point, that if 4 indicators are not relevant, you reduce the cutoff point so that if the person's deprivation is more than 18, should be considered as poor. And secondly, even with the inclusion of banking, as you rightly said, that there has been significant improvement in the banking, and that's why the reduction has come in. Also, the fertility decline has taken place. You talk about the care, neonatal care for the woman. But with even that, poverty should have really declined faster than the global index. Your global index says 139 million, and the Niti Aayog says 135 million. And I would request you to check each of the 10 indicators. You'll feel numerator and denominator are somewhat different in most of the indicators. No. For example, 18 years we have taken for death, whereas in other countries, it is, in child death rate, we have taken any death below 18 years of age as deprivation, right?
Mhm.
So just, I think there is some variation in the indicators, slightly in the age group, depending on the data availability. NFHS does not give us the nutrition data in the same way that the global report gives.
Okay, let
Right.
me
So-
open this up.
Okay,
There are
sorry.
few questions in the chat, which I would like to relate to Sabina, and then she can answer those questions as well as what you just raised. One, as we all have noted, that the public delivery of goods and services, in this particular case, food, was a rather important part of the attack on or the confrontation of COVID. How sensitive and with free food being provided, which according to most is a rather important part of income and poverty, how does your measure take account for public provision of services which are not, if you will, I guess the answer would be that you're waiting for the outcomes and therefore this is not relevant. Is that correct?
Yes.
So and when you have the outcomes, and this comes back to the original question which I faced. Well, I haven't seen either you or Amitabh or any other, what are the major advantage of using what is the extra information that the policymaker obtains by using your index? So one answer is, as you said, use all indices. But policymakers like to use as few indices as possible so they can get their heads and their policy around. So why should, the question as to why should I use is 10 indicators, all of them with measurement errors, with problems of squared, unsquared, as Amitabh was, isn't it the Occam's razor principle? And how many of these indicators do not improve with income? I mean, what is, why should, if I have and everybody agrees that you want shorthand indicators so that the policy can be quite precise and targeted, like the food policy during COVID. If I had gone into policymaker, had gone into, look, I've got this multidimensional poverty indicator, and we have to wait until the whole story is over, and then we'll tell you what happened. So I think this needs to be addressed as to the difficulties in using the multidimensional poverty indicator and the ease and the applicability to policy of a straightforward. And if there is education, well, more schools or whatever, learning deprivation, we can go on and on. Each measure will have measurement errors, each measure, including income measure and consumption measure, which is what I started off with in the beginning. So how do I reduce measurement error? How do I reduce policy error is what I guess I'm asking.
Thank you so much.
One last, I'm trying to see the bank account has been addressed. One person said livelihood options available for wages earned per month as an indicator is missed out from purchasing power. How can we factor in location? Doesn't make sense with the ease of doing business. Now, so let's leave it at the questions that Amitabh has asked and I've asked, and a couple of questions from you. Go ahead.
No, thank you so much. First, to Amitabh, it is a very good question that you ask. And theoretically, I would say it creates a non-comparability across people because the denominator and the indicators in the denominator vary. However, empirically, I'm always curious, and you can do it. I mean, one can compute that. One could actually do it and see how it's different, see what's interesting about it. I think the concern would be not being able to tell when you have a number, like the percentage of people who are poor, not being able to say what that is. It's just whatever indicators there are relevant. So that brings me to the last question, Dr. Bhalla, which is the policy uses. And last week in Oxford, we launched this OUP book by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Juan Manuel Santos, about his use of MPI when he was president in Colombia. And basically, it was about how he partnered with McKinsey to create a management structure where the key performance indicators were the 15 MPI indicators, how they had coordination across ministries, and an annual cycle of meetings at the ministerial level around each of the 15 indicators, how they had some flexible money. So if an indicator had a bottleneck, they accelerated in that area, and what they did each of the 8 years he was in office. Then how they restructured their PDS kind of system, their household targeting system, to include monetary as well as multidimensional poverty and graduation of that, and restaffed that, and how that saved money because they knew exactly which deprivations to target. And then how he involved the private sector, bringing them to the field to do little surveys on how people were poor, but then that alerted their hearts to this condition, and the private sector came in as a more active player in the poverty field. And so I think it's an interesting book. The former vice president of Costa Rica has done something similar. We're teaching executive education next week, virtually at Oxford all week. We do that every year, of how the MPI basically adds to the targeting, the budgeting, the coordination, the monitoring and evaluation, impact assessments, toolkits. It's not perfect, it's not standalone, but I think now there are clear avenues. And what governments find, particularly now with fiscal austerity, is that they want to have the biggest impact with limited resources. And the more they know about where and how people are poor, the more, in a sense, they can try to look at those. Yes, some have to be universal services, but in some cases, targeted investments in those are useful. And in other cases, actually targeted programming is useful. And I think that is a major advantage. I think the other would just be the timing, that it's there's not the lag that there is with monetary poverty measure. If you do a cash transfer, you give people money, their monetary poverty goes down, it's immediate. But if you give them jobs or education, human capital, training and productivity, new technologies, there's a lag. And so it's difficult to get the feedback loops. And it's also quite affected by the global macro situation, as you would know far better than I. And so because the MPI is a little bit more pedantic and in the middle of kids going into school, not getting jobs at a higher income, or etc., then it's perhaps easier to move within a limited time period, and there's more immediate feedback. And I think, to be honest, I'm an academic. I would love them to care ethically, but I think there's also that timeliness factor, which is one reason that governments find it quite convenient to use. And with the fiscal austerity now, they can't reach out to 75% of the population. They want to just focus on the poorest, and this is one way of doing that, defining them as overlapping deprivations. It's not perfect. I will never say that it is, but if it's useful and does something for those people in such difficult situations. Last point on COVID, we don't have data, not only in India, but in most countries post-COVID. But where we are doing, the national MPIs do, and it didn't always go up. Actually, in most countries, it went down a bit, even during the COVID period, or it went up by 1 or max 2 percentage points. But there are nuances. Very sadly and tenderly, people died. And if poor people died, your denominator changed. But then there was migration. And where there's urban to rural migration, people with good water go to a place without good water or sanitation. So you could have an increase in deprivations simply from the fact of migration and nothing else. And then there are the outcomes like nutrition. So it's a complex story. But basically, for my group, we just have to wait for the data.
Thank you very much, Sabina. Before I hand it over to Chairman, we're not going to settle, and we haven't settled the old debate of direct versus indirect measures of policy. And I'm reminded, your assumption, implicit assumption, perhaps explicit, is if you give them money, they won't put it into education, they won't put it in nutrition, they won't put it into the health of their children, they will go ahead. Now, long time back, I think Santiago Levy, when he looked at what farmers did with the cash that they got after the NAFTA agreement in Mexico, 80% of that cash that farmers got was invested. So I would have a slightly different take that if you give them money, somehow you're not targeting. And that was my original question. And we'll have to wait for another seminar as to why, and showing from evidence that, listen, if the incomes go up, these indicators don't go up, obviously, over a period of time. That, I think, would be a very useful study and support that, listen, giving income, and that gets at the root of the problem with whether you use one indicator, income, or use multiple. You need to show that one is that much better for policymakers as well as reduction of poverty than the other. Anyway, as I said, this debate will go on. Charan, over to you.
Oh my God, what a webinar. Means it was more rigorous than the classroom discussion I would have ever had with my students. And Sabina, I must thank you. I've been hearing lots about your rigorous research, and I have today for the first time witnessed what high quality research you are in. I've been really, this is our 192nd webinar, and I have absolutely no qualms in saying this was one of the most rigorous webinars we have had, extremely rich webinar that we have had, and keeping in mind the ethos of our think tank, extremely policy oriented. So I must thank you for bringing such rigorous research to us. And the discussion that we have had between Dr. Bhalla and Professor Kundu is also extremely enriching. I'm sure the participants have benefited tremendously, as have I, and I totally agree with the suggestion of Professor Kundu. This could serve as a beautiful classroom session. We would have the recording on our website by tomorrow, and I'm sure at least I will have to listen to this PowerPoint twice again, because I would like to go in depth for each of the slides that you presented and the discussion on the slides. It's very, very rich. So I want to thank you, Professor Sabina. I want to thank you, Dr. Bhalla, for chairing the session, and Professor Kundu for joining us as a discussant. I have two important announcements to make. One of it is that next week we have Professor Kenneth Stephen, who was the 13th Commissioner of National Security in the US, and he's Social Security in the US, and he'll be talking about aging and issues related to national social security measures. That's next Friday, and the timing would be around, it's pretty late, 8 to 9 p.m. We'll have that discussion, but because it's on social security, I thought it's important we should have it. I'll send you the flyer. The second thing, and I was thinking about it when Professor Sabina was making the presentation, and she had included education there. Professor, what we have done in India now, taking the advantage of the online teaching, we have started against financial literacy. We have started series of classes every day, 1 hour, 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. on economic literacy. We take up various issues that would be interesting to anybody in our country, basic macro issues, like we do take into account the monetary policy, the fiscal policy, and our aim is that we should reach out to the last man in the country, across the country, length and breadth. So we are starting that, and when you were talking about education as one of the indicators in the multidimensional poverty, I was wondering, yes, one is formal education, which is necessary, but then over a period of time, there can be sessions like ours where we try to educate people. They may not have a formal degree, but they would probably have understanding of various concepts. With this, once again, I would request you that if you have anybody in your vicinity or friendship circle to spread the word about economic literacy efforts of EGROW Foundation, please do it. We charge very nominal value because we have speakers and we pay them and we maintain an office here. So very nominal rates, but we are spreading economic literacy and covering topics which are of relevance to any decision maker. With that, let me conclude and thanks once again Professor Sabina, Dr. Bhalla, and Professor Kundu, and the participants who have been patiently listening and adding their questions in the chat box. Thank you.